He was 17, and he thought he knew the shape of winter. He had been born in the Powder River country and had buried 2 younger brothers in it, and he believed that gave him a kind of standing with the cold, the way a man who has survived a wound believes he understands the knife. His name was Caleb Ross, and in the autumn of 1884, his mother sent him east across the divide to live with a man she called his uncle, though no one in the family was certain of the blood. The man's name was Mathias Hoad. He lived alone on a flat half-a-day's ride above the North Platte, on land no one else had bothered to claim, and the letter that came back from him agreeing to take the boy had been written in pencil on the back of a tobacco wrapper. Caleb arrived on a Tuesday in late September with a canvas bag, a single wool coat that had belonged to his father, and the conviction that he was being punished. He found Mathias standing in a shallow pit beside the cabin, with his trousers rolled to the knee, mixing mud with his bare feet. The old man did not look up. He kept walking in a slow circle inside the pit, lifting his knees high, treading the mud the way a man treads grapes. Beside him sat a wooden bucket of what looked like ash, and another of chopped grass, and a third of something darker that Caleb could not name. Mathias was speaking to himself, or perhaps to the mud, in a low voice that did not stop when the boy rode up. "The wall remembers what the hand forgets," Mathias said, and went on walking. Caleb sat his horse a long moment before he dismounted. He had been told that Mathias had been a trapper once, and a good one, before something happened that no one in the family would explain. He had been told the man was strange. He had not been told the man was building his cabin out of dirt. That first night Mathias fed him beans and bread and a thin stew of rabbit, and asked him 3 questions. How far had he ridden? Could he split wood? Did he know how to keep his mouth shut when he did not understand a thing? Caleb answered the first 2 and was silent on the third, which seemed to satisfy the old man. Mathias nodded once and went to bed without another word, and Caleb lay on a straw tick by the stove and listened to the wind moving over the flat and felt, for the first time in his life, the particular loneliness of a place that does not care whether you are in it. In the morning Mathias took him out to see the cabin. It was the strangest building Caleb had ever stood beside. The walls were timber underneath. He could see that, rough cottonwood logs notched at the corners in the old way, but every inch of the outside had been smeared with a thick coat of mud the color of wet rust. The mud was not smooth. It was packed in layers, and in places Caleb could see grass and ash and what looked like horsehair worked into it. The roof was sod over planking, 2 feet deep, and the sod had been allowed to grow wild so that grass and a few late asters stood up out of it as if the cabin were trying to become a hill. There were no windows on the north side. The 2 windows on the south were small and set deep, and the glass behind them was double, 1 pane an inch in front of the other, with a finger of dead air between. "Why mud?" Caleb said. It was the only thing he could think to ask. Mathias looked at him for a long moment with eyes the color of weak coffee. "Because the wall remembers," he said again, and walked away. Word got around the settlement within a week. There was a town of sorts 7 miles to the south, a feed store, a smithy, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and the homes of perhaps 30 families spread along the creek bottom, and any new thing brought there was carried home and chewed over and spat back out. The story of the mud cabin made the rounds before Caleb had ridden into town once. By the time he went down with Mathias for supplies in the 2nd week of October, men were already laughing. The first to laugh was Burl Henning, who ran the feed store. He was a wide red man with a voice that filled a room without effort, and he greeted Mathias with the particular cheer that men use when they are about to be cruel. "Hoad," he said, "I hear you've gone to building like a prairie dog. You planning to winter underground entire or just up to the eaves?" 2 men by the stove laughed. Mathias paid for his salt and his coffee and his lamp oil and said nothing. Caleb stood beside him and felt his face burn, and when they were back on the wagon and out of town he said, without looking at the old man, "He's a fool." Mathias clucked at the mule. "He sells feed," he said. "He is good at it. A man can be good at one thing and a fool about another. There is no shortage of room in a person for both." Caleb thought about that for a mile or so. He decided he did not agree. The second to laugh was Eli Drew, who was Caleb's own age, and who he met 2 days later at the smithy when he went down alone to have a horseshoe set. Eli was the blacksmith's nephew, lean and dark-haired and quick with his tongue, and within 10 minutes of meeting Caleb he had asked 4 questions about the cabin and laughed at 3 of the answers. "Mud," he kept saying. "Mud, like a swallow's nest. "You sleep in a swallow's nest now, Ross." And then, leaning close, with the casual smile of a boy who has not yet learned that words leave marks, "You know what they call him in town? The mole. They call him the mole of the flat." Caleb laughed. He laughed because Eli was laughing, and because he was 17, and because there is a particular hunger in a boy newly arrived in a place to be counted on the inside of a joke rather than the outside of it. He laughed, and on the ride home he repeated the name to himself once, quietly, trying it out. The mole. He did not say it aloud to Mathias, but he carried it back with him, and it sat in his chest the rest of the autumn like a stone he had swallowed and could not bring back up. That was the first lesson he did not know he was learning. The work began in earnest the next morning. Mathias woke him before the sun and led him out to a low rise behind the cabin where a second pit had been dug, smaller than the first and lined with stone. "We packed the north wall today," he said. He handed Caleb a wooden tamper, a flat block on a long handle, and pointed at a heap of fine dry chaff beside the cabin, the spillings from a threshing floor, hauled in by wagon over the course of the summer, between the inner boards and the outer boards. "You tamp until it does not give, then you tamp it once more." Caleb looked at the pile of chaff. He looked at the wall of the cabin, which already seemed to him absurdly thick. He looked at the old man. "Why?" he said. Mathias considered the question as if it had been asked in a foreign language and he were translating it carefully. "Because the cold is a slow guest," he said at last. "It comes in through any door you leave open. Wood is a door, stone is a door, even mud is a door, given time. But still air is no door at all." Caleb did not understand. He nodded as if he did, and he began to tamp the chaff. What Mathias was telling him, in the language of a man who had learned the truth without ever learning the words for it, was the principle that any good builder of cold country shelters has known in some form for 1,000 years. The enemy is not cold itself, but the movement of air that carries cold across a barrier. A wall of solid wood, however thick, will conduct heat outward along its grain. A wall of stone is worse. But a cavity packed full of light, dry, fibrous material, chaff, sawdust, ash, dry moss, the siftings of a hayloft, traps the air in 10,000 tiny pockets too small for any current to form. The air itself becomes the wall. The heat of a man's body, the warmth of a small stove, the breath of a sleeping horse in the lean-to, all of it stays. The cold, finding no current to ride, hesitates at the threshold and turns back. Caleb did not know any of this. He knew only that his arms ached by mid-morning, and that the old man had told him to tamp until the chaff did not give, and then to tamp it once more, and that was what he did. By the end of the first day he had filled perhaps 4 feet of one wall. He looked at the work and felt sick at how little he had done. Mathias looked at it and grunted, which seemed to be the closest the old man came to approval, and they went inside to eat. So it went through October. They packed the walls. They sealed the seams of the door with strips of soaked rawhide that would shrink and tighten as they dried. They went up onto the roof and laid in another 4 inches of sod, and Mathias showed him how to set the sod so that the grass roots interlocked, binding the whole roof into a single living mat. They hauled stones from the creek bed and built a low berm around 3 sides of the cabin, banking it up to the windowsills on the north and west, so that the prevailing winds would have to climb over earth before they touched the wall. Caleb did not understand the berm either. He asked, "The wind has a long memory and a short patience," Mathias said. "Give it something to climb and it will spend itself climbing." Caleb wrote that one down. He had begun by the 3rd week to write the old man's sayings on the back page of a ledger he had brought with him, in pencil, in handwriting that grew smaller as the page filled. He did not know why he was doing it. He told himself it was because they were funny. The mud went on last. They mixed it in the pit, 3 buckets of clay to 1 of sand, with chopped grass for binding and a measure of ash that Mathias said would help it set hard and discourage the burrowing of insects. They smeared it on by hand. Caleb's palms cracked and bled and healed and cracked again, and he learned to work mud the way a baker works dough, by feel, knowing when it was right by the way it answered his weight. They coated every outside surface of the cabin in 3 layers, letting each one dry a full day before the next went on. By the time they were done, it was the 1st week of November, and the cabin sat on the flat like something that had grown there. Low, rounded, the color of the earth itself, almost invisible from the south road until a man was within 100 yards of it. Eli Drew rode out one afternoon to see it. He sat his horse at the edge of the property for a long time before he came in. When he did, he was laughing before he had dismounted. "Caleb," he said, Caleb, you live in a loaf of bread. He walked all the way around the cabin, touching the mud with 2 fingers, shaking his head. Burl was right. Burl said the mole was teaching you to dig, and now I see it's true. You've gone and joined him under the ground. Caleb stood by the door with his hands in his pockets. He did not laugh this time. He did not know yet why he did not laugh. He only knew that something in him had shifted in the weeks of tamping chaff. Some small private weight had moved from one side of him to the other, and the joke that had been funny in October was not funny in November. He said nothing. Eli, finding no audience, rode away within the hour, and did not come back. That night Mathias was quiet at supper. He ate slowly, and afterward he sat by the stove with his hands flat on his knees and looked at nothing for a long while. Then he said, without preamble, I will not be here for the worst of it, Caleb. Caleb looked up. I have a thing in my chest, Mathias said. It has been growing since the spring. I did not tell your mother because she would not have sent you. I am telling you now because you should know. Caleb did not know what to say. He had never been told a thing like this by a grown man. He said, finally, how long? Not long enough to see the winter through. Long enough to teach you the rest of what you need. The old man turned his head and looked at Caleb directly for the first time that evening. His eyes were the same weak coffee color they had always been. You will think I am being dramatic. I am not. I am being practical. There are 3 more things you must know before I go, and we will do them in the time we have, and you will not argue with me about any of them. Yes, yes. Caleb said. The 3 things took the rest of November. The first was the chimney. Mathias had built it himself, of fieldstone, with a flue that was not straight but bent twice in a way that struck Caleb as wrong. He had wondered about it from his first day. Now Mathias took him outside in the cold morning and made him stand below the chimney and watch the smoke. A straight flue draws hard, he said. A straight flue pulls the heat out with the smoke. The bend slows it. The bend makes the smoke give up its warmth to the stone before it leaves. The stone holds the warmth and gives it back into the room for hours after the fire is out. He pointed. Touch the wall behind the stove tomorrow morning before you build the fire. Touch it. Then you will know. Caleb touched it the next morning. The wall was warm. The second thing was the water. Behind the cabin, in a small lean-to dug half into the side of a rise, Mathias had built what he called a holding room. It was a cellar of sorts, with stone walls and a sod roof, and it held 2 wooden barrels for water, and a row of crocks for salted meat, and a long low shelf of root vegetables packed in dry sand. The barrels were the key. Mathias showed him how to wrap them in horse blankets and pack straw between the blanket and the wall. Water freezes from the outside in, he said. If you keep the cold from touching the wood, the water inside cannot find the cold. It does not freeze. It waits. Caleb nodded. He thought he understood. The third thing was the storage door. This was the part Caleb would remember. Later, when everything else had blurred, the cabin had 2 doors. One was the main door, the one a man came in and out of. The other was a small door in the back wall of the main room, no taller than Caleb's waist, leading into a long, narrow space between the inner wall and the outer wall of the north side. That space, that long, thin cavity that ran the full length of the cabin's coldest wall, was packed solid with chaff. Caleb had packed it himself in October. He had thought when he packed it that the space was wasted. It was a room a man could have used. He had said so at the time. Mathias now opened the little door and showed him the packed chaff and said, You will be tempted, when the winter is on you, and you need a place to put a thing, to pull this out. You will think you can spare it. You cannot. This wall is the one that faces the wind that kills. If you pull the chaff, the wind will come through the boards in a week. You will not feel it at first. You will only feel that the cabin is colder than it should be. By the time you understand what you have done, you will not be able to undo it. He closed the small door and set a wooden peg through the latch. Do not open this door, he said, for any reason, until the spring. Caleb said he would not. Mathias died on the 8th of December. He died in the night, quietly, in the bed against the warm wall behind the stove, and Caleb found him in the morning when he went to wake him for breakfast. The old man's face was peaceful. His hands were folded on the blanket. He had known, Caleb understood later, that the night before would be his last, and he had gone to bed clean and combed and arranged for the boy's sake. There was no note. There was nothing to be said that had not been said. Caleb sat with him for an hour. Then he went out into the cold and dug, in the frozen ground behind the cabin, with a pick and a shovel and his bare hands when the pick would not bite, a grave that took him 2 days to finish. He buried Mathias on the 10th, alone, with no preacher and no marker but a flat stone he set at the head. He stood beside it a long time. He did not pray. He did not know any prayers for a man like Mathias. He said only, aloud, to the stone and the cold and the flat empty country, the one sentence that came to him: "The wall remembers what the hand forgets." Then he went back inside and built up the fire. He heard a sound that night he could not place. He was lying in the straw bed where he had always slept, and the cabin was warm with the slow heat from the bent flue, and from somewhere in the walls came a low settling sound, a soft, deep tick repeated, like the cabin itself adjusting to its new weight. He sat up in the dark. He listened. He did not know if it was the wood contracting in the cold or the chaff settling or something else. He did not know yet whether the cabin was speaking to him or warning him. The storm began 3 days before Christmas. It came down out of the north in the way the worst storms always do, without ceremony, without the sky giving any sign a man could read at the last hour. Only a darkening of the horizon at midday, and then a dropping of the temperature so sudden that Caleb, splitting wood outside, felt the air change around him as if a door had been opened somewhere far away. He brought the axe inside. He brought in the last of the wood from the lean-to. He checked the mule and the horse in their shelter, which Mathias had built into the south side of the cabin so that the animal's heat and the cabin's heat shared a common wall. He latched the main door. He sat down by the stove. The snow began an hour later. By dark it was a wall. He had read about blizzards. He had lived through 2. He had not lived through what came that night. The wind did not blow. It shrieked. It found every angle of the cabin and tried each one, and was turned back by mud and chaff and earth and sod. And what Caleb heard from inside was not the wind itself, but the long howl of it sliding off the rounded shape of the building, unable to take hold. The cabin did not shake. It hummed. He sat by the stove and listened. He listened for 3 days. The wind did not stop. The snow did not stop. He fed the fire small pieces at long intervals, the way Mathias had taught him, because the bent flue held heat so well that a large fire was a waste and a danger. He went out twice a day through the door into the animal shelter to break the ice on the water trough and to give the mule and the horse their measure of hay. He did not go out the main door at all. He could not have if he had wanted to. The snow against it was 4 feet deep by the second morning and rising. On the 4th day the fire began to smoke. It was a small thing at first, a wisp coming back down the flue, curling out into the room, hanging in the air. Caleb stood up from his chair and went to the stove and looked. He opened the damper wider. The smoke thickened. He closed it. The smoke thickened more. He understood, with the slow cold clarity of a boy who has been told a thing once and is now remembering it, that snow had built up over the chimney top and the flue could not draw. He would have to go up onto the roof. He could not go out the main door. The snow was past the lintel now, packed and frozen. He stood in the middle of the cabin and turned in a slow circle, and his eyes came to rest on the small door at the back of the room. The little door to the chaff cavity. If he pulled the chaff out, only a portion of it, only enough to make a passage, he could break through the outer boards of the north wall and climb up the drift to the roof. He could clear the chimney. He could come back down and pack that chaff back in. He had his hand on the latch of the storage door. One pull and the chaff packing would spill out, and he could use the space for what he needed. He stood there for a long moment. He did not know yet whether his life would be decided by what he did in the next minute or by something he had done weeks before. He heard Mathias's voice, not in his ear. He was not a boy who imagined such things, but in his memory, plain and dry as it had been on a November afternoon. Do not open this door for any reason. Until the spring, he took his hand off the latch. He stood in the middle of the room and thought. He thought slowly, because the smoke was making his eyes water and his head ache, and slow thought was the only kind he could manage. The chimney was blocked. The flue would not draw. If he did not clear it, the cabin would fill with smoke, and he would have to put the fire out. And if he put the fire out, the cold would come in through the only door the cold still had, the inside of him, where his own warmth lived. He had to clear the chimney, but he could not open the storage door. There was, he remembered, a small hatch in the sod roof above the main room. Mathias had cut it the first summer, for clearing the flue if it ever needed clearing, and had covered it with a square of planking that pushed up from inside. Caleb had forgotten about it. He had not thought of it once in 3 months. He looked up. The square of planking was there, set flush with the ceiling, almost invisible in the lamplight. He dragged the table beneath it. He stood on the table. He pushed. The hatch lifted, and a cascade of snow came down over him, and the cold rushed in like a living thing, and he came up through the hatch onto the roof of the cabin and into the storm. The wind nearly took him off. He went flat against the sod and crawled. He found the chimney by feel, the stone of it warm under his hand even through the snow, and he cleared the snow from the top with his bare hands and an iron poker he had brought up through the hatch. The drift was 3 feet deep over the cap. He worked for perhaps 20 minutes. When the smoke began to draw clean and straight up into the white sky, he crawled back to the hatch and lowered himself through and closed it behind him. He sat on the floor of the cabin a long time before he could feel his hands again. The chaff in the north wall was untouched. The storm broke on the 9th day. Then it came back. Then it broke again. Then it came back again. By the middle of January, Caleb had stopped counting storms and started counting only the days between them, which were sometimes 2 and sometimes only 1. The cabin held. The bent flue gave back its slow heat through the stone. The packed chaff in the walls turned the cold at the threshold and turned it again. The double-paned windows showed frost on the outer pane and dry glass on the inner. The water in the barrels in the holding room did not freeze. The animals in the lean-to grew shaggy and patient and ate their hay. Caleb thought about Eli Drew. He thought about Burl Henning. He thought about the men he did not know in the town 7 miles to the south, whose chimneys he could not see from his window because there were no chimneys to see, only a long, unbroken country of snow, white in the day, and blue in the evening and black at night. He wondered how they were faring. He wondered, with a coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather, whether some of them were not faring at all. He had a thought one night, sitting by the stove, that he did not want to have. He thought, I laughed too, in October. I laughed at the name, and he understood in the slow way that a young man understands the things that will shape him, that the laughter had been the easiest part of his life, and the unlaughing was going to be the work of years. He took down the ledger with the old man's sayings in it. He read them through. There were 11 of them. He read them aloud, one at a time, to the empty cabin, and the cabin listened in its low, warm hum. And when he came to the last one, the wall remembers what the hand forgets. He said it twice, and then he closed the book and put it on the shelf above the stove, where Mathias had kept his coffee tin. The thaw came in the last week of March. It came slow, which was a mercy. A sudden thaw would have brought the roof down with the weight of melting snow, but this thaw came in fits and starts over 10 days, and the sod roof held, and the mud on the walls held, and the berm of earth around the north side gave up its snow in slow gray rivers that ran off into the flat without touching the wall. Caleb went out on the first warm afternoon and walked around the cabin 3 times, looking at it. The mud was cracked in a few places. The sod was thin at the eaves. The chimney needed repointing. None of it mattered. The cabin had held. He rode down to the town on the 2nd of April. He did not know what he would find. He had heard nothing for 4 months. He rode slowly, on the mule because the horse had thrown a shoe and he had not yet learned to set one as well as he meant to. And he watched the country open out around him as he came down off the flat. There were trees down. There were fences gone. He passed a homestead a mile north of the creek, where the roof had collapsed. And no one was living in what was left. And he did not stop because he was afraid of what he might find inside. The town was thinner than he remembered. There were people in it. There was smoke from some of the chimneys. But the smithy was closed and Eli Drew's uncle was nowhere to be seen. And the feed store had a hand-lettered sign in the window that said closed until further word, and Burl Henning was not there. Caleb sat on his mule in the middle of the road and looked at the closed store, and a woman he did not know came out of the church and walked over to him and told him, in a flat voice that had given up on softness, that Burl had died in January, that the Drews had lost a child, that 4 families on the South Fork were gone, moved out, or worse, no one was certain yet which, that the winter had been the worst in living memory. She looked at him a long moment after she said it, and she said, "You're the Hoad boy, aren't you? From the flat?" "Yes," Caleb said. "You came through it." "Yes," Caleb said. She nodded once. She did not ask how. She did not ask anything. She turned and walked back toward the church, and Caleb sat on his mule in the empty street and felt a thing settle in him that he did not have words for, and would not have words for a long time yet. He rode home in the late afternoon. The light was long and gold across the flat, and the mud cabin on the rise was the same color as the land around it, and the smoke from its bent flue went up straight and clean into the spring sky. He stood in the dooryard a long time before he went in. He spoke aloud, to no one, the sentence he had said over Matthias's grave in December. He said it the way Matthias had said it, slow and without weight, as if remarking on the weather. The wall remembers what the hand forgets. He nodded once when he had said it. He did not say it to anyone else, not that spring and not the spring after, and not in any of the springs that followed in the long life he went on to live in that country. He kept it. He kept all 11 of them. Wisdom does not always arrive in time to be thanked. But it arrives. If this story stayed with you, there is another waiting on the shelf for the next quiet evening.